Good morning. So we're on back to the Gemara, Kufay Aleph 105a. So let's bring ourselves to where we are. So we're following the Gemara on its tangential tentacles. So let's try to bring us back to where we are. And we're taking extra tangents considering that we're going to the Shulchan Aruch, so that takes it a little farther out. So let's bring us back to where we are. Right, this chapter is discussing the night of Passover, the night of Pesach, and in so doing, it started with pre-Pesach. When does one need to stop eating in order to build up an appetite coming to the Seder? We compared that to when does one have to stop eating, if at all, on a regular Shabbos and Yom Tov in preparation for the Yom Tov, which led us to this discussion about if you're eating a meal Friday afternoon and the sun sets and Shabbos begins, what do you do? And we're coming back to that right now. But in the middle, the Gemara took us in a bunch of other things that were somewhat related to the laws of Kiddush, which then led us to the laws of Hagafen and Bracha extending from one room to another, right? Because you're making Kiddush in one place, you're eating somewhere else. Does the Kiddush extend, does it not extend? And all of that was related to the fact that on this Friday afternoon meal, you're breaking your meal to make Kiddush in the middle. That was the halacha, right? But that scenario was discussed, which led us in all these other tangents, including what we just finished, which was the laws of Havdalah, especially as it pertains to Havdalah that's combined into Kiddush too, and whether you can combine brachas into one cup or not combine brachas into one cup, right? Because in the case of Kiddush and a meal, you have the cup of benching and the cup of Kiddush. Could you combine those? Well, we compared it to combining Havdalah and Kiddush into one cup, right? So this is where we are on this. So we're coming back now to the question of making Kiddush in the spot where you eat. We're not done yet for another 3 pages till Kuf Zayin on the discussion of Kiddush and the fact that you're breaking your meal to make Kiddush in the middle, which will lead to where does Kiddush at all come from, right? And then in so doing, the Gemara also discusses where does Havdalah come from, because Havdalah and Kiddush are very much related, right? One opens the day, one closes the day. Are they the same? In what ways are the same? In what ways are they different? So the discussion of Kiddush and Havdalah really goes the next 3 pages or so, mostly around Kiddush, Havdalah as a comparison. So here's how I'd like to do it. This is how we've been doing it, and I keep on going. So the laws of Kiddush that are discussed in these pages, including other places in the Gemara discuss these issues, is all in chapter Reish Ein Aleph, 271, Alter Shulchan Aruch, and Shulchan Aruch, I think. Yeah, 271, Reish Ein Aleph. It's a rather large chapter with 30 subsections and halachas. And I'm going to wait till we finish the entire discussion and go through that, because the way that chapter is formulated, it gives it to us as a fully set table, whereas the Gemara gives it in piecemeal. So we've already learned sections of that chapter, which are in subsection 25, 26. And subsection 1 is going to come in 2 pages from now. Meaning that chapter is going to begin with the mitzvah of Kiddush is X. We haven't discussed that yet in the Gemara. We just discussed various details about the fact that Kiddush has to be the place that it eats, and the fact that the Kiddush has to be whatever different details, which come later in that chapter. Right, so I want to wait till the end, and then we're going to go through that chapter slowly and see really the halachas of Kiddush properly after having learned these last few pages. When it comes to Havdalah, we're going to do it a bit differently. When it comes to Havdalah, because it's being brought in as like a comparison to Kiddush, whenever we read a specific halacha about Havdalah, we're going to go to the Shulchan Aruch, which is what we've done. Right? Yesterday we learned the halachas of the text of the Havdalah. Before we learned the halachas of when you combine an Havdalah with Kiddush. We learned the halachas of some of the halachas, at least, of the candle of Havdalah. Right? So as we go to little pieces of Havdalah, we're going to look at those parts of the Shulchan Aruch. But for Kiddush, we'll wait till we have a full picture and go through the whole thing. So that's gonna be the Seder.
Roadmap.
Yeah, it's our roadmap. So because Kiddush is the main section, we'll wait till it's done and then get a full picture from the Shulchan Aruch of Kiddush. The tangents, as the Gemara goes through the tangents, we'll select from the Shulchan Aruch that covers those tangents, as we did with eating and making a bracha and moving from one room to another. Right? So the next subject then that we're going to be taking on tangent here is the prohibition to eat before making Havdalah. That's the next tangent. So the Gemara is going to take us back to our original discussion, which is making Kiddush on Friday afternoon when you're in the middle of a meal, right? You started a meal. That was the original discussion. You started a meal Friday afternoon. The sun sets. What do you do now? Can you continue your meal? Do you have to stop your meal? Do you make kiddush in the middle of your meal? Right? Those are the three options. So the Gemara is going to revisit that, but it's going to take us on a tangent in comparing it to Havdalah about the fact that you may not eat before you make Havdalah. So that's the next tangent coming up. And when we finish that tangent, we're going to look at the Shulchan Aruch and discuss that tangent. Okay, and then we'll come back to it. Another detail in Havdalah compared to Kiddush, which is if you didn't make Havdalah right away, can you do it the next day? Can you do how far in the week can you make Havdalah? Or how far into Shabbos can you make Kiddush? Like, can you make Kiddush in the morning if you forgot to do Friday night? That's going to be the next tangent. So this is where we're going. As we go through the Kiddush, we're going to follow the tangents into the Halacha. But once we finish the whole subject of Kiddush, then we'll look at the Halacha of the Kiddush. This is going to be our program going the next couple of weeks, I suppose.
What's the time between the Shabbos eating?
Okay, we're going to get to all that. We'll get to all of that, yes. That's going to be the next tangent. Is when you start eating before, at what point to stop eating? Do you have to stop eating? When did I start? When didn't I start? We're going to go through all of that, God willing, in the next few days or so, over the next week. Okay, so now we know where we are. We know where we're going. Yeah. Okay, so 3 lines on the top of the page of Kofei Medalef, 105a. Timing just starting.
Oh, really?
Yeah, third line on 105a, second to last word. Rav Chanina bar Shloimeh, Rav Chanina son of Shloimeh, the Talmidei de Rav, and some of the students of Rav, have a Yosef b'Sudasa, were sitting at a meal, the Koyu Alayu, and Rav Hamnuna Saba. Rav Hamnuna Saba was attending to them. The formulation of how they're sitting around is interesting in itself, and I'm sure those who are historians, I'm sure they observe this. Because the way it's phrased here is Rav Chanina bar Shloimeh and the students of Rav. It sounds like Rav Chanina bar Shloimeh was not a student of Rav. Right? And moreover, as we'll see soon, the only one who really does talking of significance is Rav Hamnuna Saba, which is the attendant. The rest of them are put together in one group. But somehow the Gemara wants to select this scholar, Rav Chanina bar Shloimeh, and identify his name, and identify him and the students of Rav, as if he wasn't a student of Rav. Why was his name selected out? I'm sure the historians have a little observance on this. I'm just pointing out. Anyway, so there's a scholar sitting around, and Rav Hamnuna is attending to them. What's also interesting, as we'll see in a moment, is that ordinarily, as I noted before, when you have when the Gemara describes someone attending to someone else, it's usually that the attendant, I'm sorry, is there to observe the attendees. That's why he's there, right? He's standing over these great scholars to observe their behavior. We had that before, where one person A was watching person B and comes back and tells us that person B was doing such and such, and therefore it must be the halacha this way, right? But here we're going to see that actually the attendant teaches the attendees, which is, again, interesting. And I'm not sure what to make of it, but I'm just putting it out there. Okay, so Amrulay, they said to him, that is to say, the attendants said to the attendee, which is Rav Hamnuna. So they said to Rav Hamnuna, Zil Chazi, please go out and observe. They're in the middle of their meal. It's Friday afternoon, and they've been sitting for a while. So they tell him, Zil Chazi, go have a look. In Mekadesh Yoma, if the day became holy, meaning did the sun set? Is it Shabbos already? Please go look. He's the attendant, so they're sending him on a mission, right? Why not? And if Shabbos comes, Nafsik will stop our meal, v'nikvil Shabbata, and we'll start a new meal for Shabbos. Right? Remember, we had 3 opinions as to how one should behave if Shabbos happens in the middle of a meal. Person's eating on Friday afternoon and the sun sets. We had a dispute between Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Yossi, which are sages of the Tanaic era, one of which said, I think it was Rabbi Yossi, he said, don't stop your meal, just keep on going. Don't worry about it. And when you're done your meal, then you'll first take a cup of wine, make Kiddush, then you'll take another cup of wine and close out your previous meal. And that's it. That was Rabbi Yossi's opinion. And Rabbi Huda said, no, stop your meal right now. And because you got to stop your meal right now, the first thing is take a cup of wine and finish your meal. And then another cup of wine and make Kiddush. Or all the way around? No, all the way around. All the way around. Rabbi Yossi said, when you keep on going with your meal, bench and then make kiddush. Whereas Rabbi Huda said,
he said that you
why are we guessing? Let's go back.
first and then you bench.
Why are we guessing? Let's go back. So what did you say?
The way you said it the first time.
Was
You
correct?
make kiddush first and then you bench. But that's what I
But there was a dispute both ways, right?
That was Rabbi Yossi.
Sorry?
I thought that was Rabbi Yossi.
Which was Rabbi Yossi's view?
You continue your meal and then you make kiddush and then you bench.
So let's see. Oops, went too far. Rabbi Yossi said, Huda says, Rabbi Yossi says, don't stop, keep on going. Rabbi Huda says, stop. Okay, now when it comes to which cup of wine do you hold? Which cup of wine is which? Wait, I went too far back. I'm just looking it up here. Okay, this is about making kiddush and shul. This is about changing location. It's all the tangents. Okay. Rabbi Huda said that the first cup you make for kiddush, and then the second one you make for benching. That is, in Rabbi Huda's view, Rabbi Huda said, you don't have to break your meal, right? You keep on going.
Mhm.
What was the other?
What did I just say?
Yossi said that.
You said Rabbi Huda.
Right. Rabbi Huda said you have to stop your meal.
Yeah.
So since Rabbi Huda said you have to stop your meal, therefore the first thing you do is kiddush arrives, you have to make kiddush right away, and then make Havdalah. Rabbi Yossi said, keep on going when you're done, and when you're done, you make Havdalah and make kiddush.
Right.
Yes, okay. Those are two opinions of the Mishnaic era. But then Shmuel, which comes in the Gemara's era, post Mishnah, said, don't stop your meal at all. Not like Rabbi Yossi, not like Rabbi Huda. You don't just keep on going. Neither do you have to stop your meal. In the middle of your meal, you cover the bread and make kiddush. Okay. Now these students who are sitting around, Rav Hamnuna is observing them, and he tells them, the students tell Rav Hamnuna, go outside and see if Shabbos came. Because if Shabbos came, we're going to stop right now. So they're following, obviously, Rabbi Yehuda's view.
Mhm.
And what's their reasoning? This is how Rashbam explains it from their phrasing. They said, let's stop so we can set our meal for Shabbos. Because halacha is, once you have the mitzvah of making kiddush, Shabbos started, you may not eat until you do that mitzvah. This is a rule in general, especially when it comes to kiddush, it's even more heightened. But in general, there's a rule at the moment you have a mitzvah that comes upon you, you may not do anything, including eating, until you observe that mitzvah. So in the morning of Sukkot, you may not eat until you shake the lulav and esrog. In the morning of Rosh Hashanah, you may not eat until you blow shofar. And every morning, you may not eat until you say Shema in the morning, or even put on tefillin. Okay, Chabad, we eat a little bit before because we want to have the energy to be able to daven properly. We'll leave that alone. But as a rule, the moment the mitzvah comes upon you, you may not eat. So same thing with kiddush. The moment Shabbos starts, you have a mitzvah for kiddush. You may not eat anything until you make kiddush. Yeah, with kiddush is even more because the kiddush has to be in the place of a meal, and Shabbos has a meal, and so on and so forth. Okay, so therefore they said, the second Shabbos comes in the middle of the meal, we got to stop because we may not eat now until we make kiddush. And then the nikvi l'shabbata, that's how they phrase it. Then we'll reestablish we'll reestablish this meal that we're sitting at as a Shabbos meal, which would mean what they're observing is Rabbi Huda's opinion. They'll stop, bench, make kiddush, and then have their new meal.
More stringent view, essentially.
So the halacha is to cover the meat, we'll get to the halacha, yeah? So this is what they tell him. So again, he's the attendant, but yet he's telling them what the halacha is. Amar lahu, Rav Hamnuna tells them, like tzlichusu, you don't have to do that. You don't have to stop your meal and then reestablish it because it's a Shabbos meal.
So what happens to the 2 hours before?
What 2 hours before?
That you're not allowed to eat 2 hours before?
They were eating the whole time Friday afternoon. They were already eating. Friday afternoon, they were sitting and eating, and they kept on going.
So they're eating before Shabbos?
Yep.
They didn't stop 2 hours before?
No. Kept on going. Okay, assuming we discussed this before, assuming they started early enough that you're allowed to, and they kept on going. Let's just assume that. And then when the time came for making kiddush, they told him, let us know, did Shabbos start? And if Shabbos started, we're going to end our meal here and reestablish this very meal as a Shabbos meal.
of eating.
or it's at least you have to imagine yourself that you're in the Roman what do they call those porticos, where they're sitting there and having a slow meal with the wine and the fruits and the bread and the oil. They're doing the old the original Fabrengens. Okay, so Amar Lahu, Rav Hamnuna, the attendant now tells them halacha, which again I'm pointing out is interesting. Amar Lahu, he tells them, like shlichus, you don't need to do that. You don't need to stop your meal and then reestablish it as a Shabbos meal. Shabbata kavan afshay. Shabbos arrives on its own. So the very fact that the sun set and you're sitting and eating, this is your Shabbos meal. You don't have to stop and reestablish it as a Shabbos meal. It happens automatically. So what do you have to do?
Honor it, no?
Cover the bread, make Kiddush, and then keep on going, because the meal itself has already been established as a Shabbos meal by dint to the fact that it is Shabbos right now. This is Shmuel's view, essentially.
So you mean to
Yeah, it's already there.
Exactly.
Shabbos is already there.
so you mean to tell me that they were eating all this time without bread?
Sorry?
They were eating all this
They
time,
were eating with bread. Why?
so then they have to make another bracha for bread.
No, why would make another bracha for the bread? That's the point here. He's saying the fact that Shabbos arrives itself establishes it as a Shabbos meal. You don't have to stop and then reinstitute your meal as a Shabbos meal.
It converts another.
It converts into a Shabbos meal along with the day. Just like the day automatically becomes Shabbos, so does your meal automatically become a Shabbos meal. So all you need to do is stop, pause in your meal, make Kiddush, and keep on going.
But after Kiddush, we always make the bracha over.
Over here, in this case, you better see earlier. That's the uniqueness of the halacha.
So you can do that before.
Say it again.
So they could do that before. I missed just do the Kiddush for the wine. I missed the bracha for the bread because they already said it before.
That's right. So they washed earlier. They made a bracha on Motzi. Now that Shabbos starts, and Shabbos says, "Hey, you're not allowed to eat until you make Kiddush." They take a challah cover the bread that's sitting on the table, make Kiddush, open up the challah, and keep on eating.
And they don't eat the bracha on the challah.
They already did earlier, because that's the point of teaching them. You don't have to stop your meal and reinstate it as a Shabbos meal. The fact that Shabbos arrived already makes it into a Shabbos meal. All you need to do is stop eating until you make your Kiddush. As per the halacha, you're not allowed to eat until you make Kiddush. Yeah.
Shabbos in and of itself was already there.
Correct. And thus the meal becomes a Shabbos meal. And because it's already Shabbos, you may not eat until you make Kiddush. So just stop your meal, make your Kiddush, and keep on eating. As per Shmuel.
Now, like me, I don't know if it's right or not, to be honest, I never asked, but now when it comes in very late, sometimes I still want my kids to do like the Shabbat meal just to know what's going on and not feed them like earlier and go to bed and then they miss out on Shabbat. So we'll start, let's say, at 7:40, 7:30 to eat. We'll eat, and then if Shabbat comes in, I'll stop and I'll let them see Kiddush or whatever, and then I just put them to bed. I'll continue eating.
Do that all the time.
So you could do that.
When I do that, I myself don't eat till after Kiddush. My wife and I don't eat. Yeah.
Okay.
So we feed the kids. So by the time my wife and I sit down for the table, the kids are already fed.
Right.
And they just join me for Kiddush. And then maybe I'll give them a little challah because it's part of like the ceremony.
Yeah.
And then whatever they play or they go to bed, whatever the age is appropriate. But for summer months, my kids have already eaten supper before Shabbos starts. Right. It's just not practical otherwise.
Yeah.
But my wife and I, we don't eat till after Kiddush, but the kids have already eaten.
But are you allowed to or no?
So okay, we'll get to the halacha. We'll get there. Yeah. Okay. So, and now he goes further and says, the Amar Rav, because Rav says, now again, many of the students sitting around the table here are Rav students. So Rav Hamnuna is now teaching them, and says, the Amar Rav said, your teacher, at least many of you sitting there, yeah, with me, yeah,
Yeah.
Kashem Shah Shabbos Kaivas Lemaiser, just as Shabbos establishes what the state of your eating meiser is. I'll explain what that is. Shabbos Kaivas Lekiddush. So the Shabbos automatically establish itself in your obligation to make Kiddush, and thus you don't have to stop your meal in order to make Kiddush. It happens automatically. So what does he mean when we talk about meiser? Very briefly. So the meiser, of course, is tithe that one has to give from produce, right?
Yeah.
Now, the produce has to be processed up to a certain point in order for the obligation to give meiser to commence. Meaning, while it's still attached to the ground, you're not obligated to give meiser yet. When you harvest it, then you prepare it. There's a whole process you have to do, and I think the final process is you bring it into your home. You bring it into your
Collect it into a bin or
into your like your storage space in your barn. And then now that you're done your process, now you have to give the tithe. Okay. Now, so there's a point at which the food is edible, but you're not obligated to Meiser yet. So are you allowed to eat of that produce yet? Once the produce is now required in Meiser because you finish the process, you may not eat until you give your Meiser. This is called tevel. One may not eat until the Meiser is given. But here, the food is edible, but the obligation for Meiser hasn't begun yet because I didn't do the final process. So the halacha is that I'm allowed to eat it temporarily, like a snack. I'm allowed to snack on it, but I may not sit down for a proper meal for it. That's the halacha. So I can snack, but not for a proper meal. So says Rav, Shabbos is a special day, and therefore a snack on Shabbos is like a meal. And therefore you could not snack on these foods on Shabbos, because even though it's for you to snack, but because you're snacking on Shabbos, Shabbos gives it that permanency that it's special, and therefore it's treated as if it was a permanent meal, and if you're not allowed to eat unless it's been tithed. Yeah. So this is Rav's view that Shabbos itself imposes its status on what you are doing, even without your intentionality. So you're only eating a snack, but Shabbos says, no, this is a meal. And therefore you may not eat because it's Meiser. And the same thing with Kiddush. You're busy eating Friday afternoon, and Shabbos comes, and in your mind, whatever, I'm still just eating my meal Friday. Says Shabbos, no, I'm here. Stop your meal, make Kiddush, and then continue your meal. You don't have to stop your meal and restart it on Shabbos. Shabbos does it automatically. By the fact that Shabbos arrives, Shabbos itself tells you, stop eating because I'm here now. And therefore acknowledge and then continue. You don't have to end your meal and then restart your meal. I arrived and I turned your meal into Shabbos meal. It's like I turned your snack into permanent meal. Following?
That's both Shmuel and Rav's view.
Oh, so now what we're getting here is that not only is Shmuel of the opinion that in the middle of your meal you cover the bread and make Kiddush. Now we're learning Rav is also of that view.
Sounds similar.
Even though Rav phrases it differently. Because Shmuel speaks in terms of the Kiddush responsibility. Rav speaks of it in terms of you may not continue eating your meal until you make Kiddush. And that Shabbos itself turns it into a Kiddush meal. So he comes at it from a different angle, but the same conclusion. Through the law against eating before you make Kiddush. By telling you, in other words, in Rabbi Huda's view, where you can keep on eating until you're done, you are eating before you make Kiddush. Right? Because you keep on going into your meal and you make Kiddush at the end. In Rabbi Yossi's view, Shabbos didn't turn your meal into a Shabbos meal. You have to stop and make a new meal for Shabbos meal. Whereas Rav is saying, no, the second Shabbos arrives, Shabbos says you may not eat until you make Kiddush. And anything you eat now, post Kiddush, is Shabbos meal. Why? Because I said so. Even though you started your meal 2 hours ago.
It makes sense.
Okay, following?
It makes such sense. Point of view of the Sod, the mystery, Shabbos, is the fact, the whole idea of a palace in time. Everything else it goes into a different state of time. But on Shabbat, the time.
So to add to that,
You remember what Abraham Joshua Heschel brings us out with the idea of the palace in time. And as a result, everything that takes place then is a completely different dimension within time than it is for the rest of
I'm going to add to that in a moment, but first I want to make sure Alan is clear.
I'm just not happy with it. It's not.
Rephrase that. I don't understand it yet.
I don't understand it yet. But what Shabbat, I can understand continuing. Okay.
Yeah.
But the Shabbos bread is a Shabbos bread. It's covered.
Okay.
Okay. So when you uncover it, you should make the next bracha on the bread.
But you already made a bracha 2 hours earlier.
Yeah, but this is a Shabbos bread.
Right. So the question is, who turns that bread into Shabbos bread? If I'm the one doing it, then I have to stop, close out my other meal, and make a new bracha. What Rav is saying is Shabbos does that automatically. You don't have to do anything to make that into Shabbos bread. By the fact that I'm here, that's why it's Shabbos bread. And if all you have to do is just make Kiddush. If making it into Shabbos bread was on you, then you would have to end out your weekday bread and restart with the Shabbos bread. But Shabbos says, I make it into Shabbos bread anyway. So all you have to do is make Kiddush.
This is the dispute.
That's what Rav is saying.
So if they're eating,
That the Shabbos itself imposes its holiness onto the food you're eating, and you have to do nothing. So keep on eating. Make Kiddush first, because Allah says you may not eat until you make Kiddush. But I turn that bread into Shabbos bread. And if you don't have to close out your old meal and restart your new meal, as they want to do. So I wanted to add to what you're saying. Shabbos is one of the only things that are holy unto itself. Shabbos, the kacha v'kaima. Everything else, the holiness of that thing is by dint of the Jew's activity. So I take the leather and turn it into tefillin. A Jew does that. Until then, the tefillin is mundane. Even Yom Tif, which is on a day, and when the day arrives, it's Yom Tif, it's still established by the Jew. How so? Because the calendar is established by the Jew.
Sighting of the moon.
The sighting of the moon, or our established calendar based on the calculation, but we're the ones that do that, which is why when we make the bracha to sanctify Yom Tif in davening or in Kiddush, we say, Mekadosh Yisrael vazmanim. You sanctified Israel and time. Because it's through Israel, through the Jew, that these days of Yom Tov become sanctified, based on our calendar. But Shabbos, Nekacha v'kaima. Shabbos is holy and stands. Doesn't matter what you do or don't do, Shabbos is Shabbos. We have an obligation to increase and bring Shabbos in early, but Shabbos is Shabbos independent of the Jews' activities. The one and only holiness in Yom Tov, in Judaism, that's like imposed from above, irrespective of how Jews behave or don't. Even Yom Tov is dependent on the Jew in terms of establishing what the Yom Tov is.
Kiddush doesn't bring in Shabbos.
Exactly.
Correct. So Kiddush doesn't bring in Shabbos.
That may be a misunderstanding.
It's Shabbos itself imposes upon you and says, hey, I'm here. You have to stop everything and acknowledge me. And then I turn everything you're doing into Shabbos mode. So stop eating your meal, acknowledge me, but that meal you're eating, I just turned it into Shabbos mode meal. You have to do nothing to make it
Some
Shabbos.
people think Kiddush is bringing in.
If you make Kiddush before Shabbos starts, if you make Kiddush before Shabbos starts, or you light candles before Shabbos starts, then in doing so, you're exactly because you're bringing the Shabbos upon you early.
Yeah.
But if you don't do that, Shabbos is Shabbos, which is why you may not light Shabbos candles after Shabbos starts.
Yeah, exactly.
Because Shabbos is here. You can't light the Shabbos candles afterwards. Okay.
Can you bless them afterwards?
You lit them earlier and blessed them later?
Where, let's say,
Good question. I don't know if I
the
know.
country asks my in-laws, and let's say her mom lit the candles Shabbat before. She made her blessing, and my wife was busy with the kids upstairs. And by the time she came downstairs,
Already
Shabbat
Shabbos.
was ready for a few minutes.
But the
Can she
candles are
bless
lit already.
early?
Can she make a bracha?
Yeah.
Good question. I'll have to look into it. I don't know the answer. My okay, I don't want to say anything.
Okay.
A lot of misconceptions.
So that's what we're learning.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's such a beautiful way of bringing it out, all this discussion, because of the fact that, as I was saying the other day, it's the type of Talmudic discussion that would take place, and it's all.
I like to think so at least.
It should be more of a program.
That's what real learning is.
Yeah.
Okay, let's keep on going a little bit more. Amra Lahuda Amra. No, sorry, I back up. Sorry. So Savar they wanted to derive from here. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So now the students of Rav, along with Rav Chanina Bar Shalmei, they just discovered from Rav Hamnuna Saba, they just discovered that by dint of the fact that Shabbos begins, it turns your meal into a Shabbos meal, and therefore you may not eat until you make Kiddush. But the meal itself is already Shabbos meal by the fact that it's there. So you can't eat, stop, acknowledge, cover the bread, acknowledge Shabbos by making Kiddush, and then keep on going as if it was a Shabbos meal, considering that Shabbos turned it into a Shabbos meal.
Does Shabbos turn into a Shabbos meal, or
Shabbos does, not my Kiddush.
Right.
If I turn it into a Shabbos meal, then I would have to bench to close out my weekday meal and restart again with my Shabbos meal, which is what they wanted to do.
Before Shabbos even comes
Or
in.
just as Shabbos begins. At some point once Shabbos begins. And I'm going to say you don't have to do that. Shabbos already turned it into your Shabbos meal. All you need to do is stop eating, considering Shabbos is here, make Kiddush, and then you continue. Okay. Sover Minei, they wanted to therefore derive from this. They learned this new halacha. So they wanted to say, Ki heichid the kavala Kiddush, just as the arrival of Shabbos brings with it the obligation of Kiddush and therefore forbids you from eating until you make Kiddush. Tach kavala havdalah. Perhaps the same thing happens when Shabbos ends. If you're eating Shabbos afternoon, let's say you wash for Shal Shabbos, and you washed early enough, and your meal keeps on going, it's farbrengen, and now the sun sets. So they thought, well, if I have to stop my meal on the way in because, hey, Shabbos is here, stop your meal and acknowledge it because Shabbos turned your meal into a Shabbos meal. So maybe as you're going out, the fact that it's now Sunday or whatever, it's Saturday night, and now Shabbos is over, it just turns your Shal Shabbos into Malav Malka. It just turns your Shabbos meal into a weekday meal. And therefore, you may not continue eating until you make Havdalah. So pause your meal, make Havdalah, and keep on going. Just like you would pause your meal, make Kiddush, and keep on going. That's what they thought. Amalahu Rav Amram, But Rav Hamram responds. I'm assuming Rav Amram was one of the students of Rav who are in this group, right? Which again, a historian might look at this and say, "Hey, now we know Rav Amram was a student of Rav," because the Gemara said earlier, "Eser v'chanina bar Shalmei with the students of Rav." And now the only other identified person here speaking is Rav Amram. So Rav Amram must be from the students of Rav there, right? That's what I would assume a historian would do. Although again, I'm sure there's more details that I'm missing in terms of the history of who these people are. But so Rav Amram is there and he says, no. Hachi Amar Rav. This is what Rav said. I'm a student of Rav, as you all are, and I heard the following from Rav. L'kiddush kavas, v'lavdala v'loy lahavdala kavas. Kiddush, when Shabbos begins, it establishes itself as, hey, I'm here, stop everything and acknowledge me, and I turn your meal into a Shabbos meal, but does not do so for Havdalah. Because, as I said earlier, a Jew doesn't create Shabbos, but a Jew has the ability to extend Shabbos. So Shabbos, if I make Kiddush early before Shabbos starts, or I light candles before Shabbos starts, which is what I'm supposed to do, I'm bringing Shabbos early, that's fine. And if I don't make Havdalah yet, then I've extended Shabbos. And therefore, if I'm sitting at my meal Shabbos afternoon, and the meal keeps on going to Matzah Shabbos, I don't have to stop and make Havdalah, because Havdalah doesn't impose itself onto Shabbos. Shabbos imposes itself onto your weekday, but a weekday does not impose itself on Shabbos. And therefore, you keep on going as if it was a Shabbos meal, and when you're done, you make Havdalah.
Make a double on Monday.
Okay, we'll learn about that also.
Up to Wednesday.
Tuesday.
The source for that is in this Gemara, which we'll get to.
Right.
The Gemara continues. I want to conclude this, and then tomorrow we'll go straight to the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, Bahani Mili. This is true. Le'inyan mifsak. When it comes to stopping your meal, you don't need to stop your meal on Shabbos afternoon, even though the sun set and Shabbos is over, because you're extending Shabbos with your meal, so you don't have to stop your meal. But to start a meal, once the obligation for Havdalah arrives, you may not stop. You may not start. I'm sorry. When may you not start? How early? We'll get that in the Shulchan Aruch. But let's just assume right now it's sunset. Let's just assume it's sunset, right? We have the two times for sunset or nightfall. Let's just assume it's sunset, the beginning of that time. After that time hits, you may not eat. So to answer your question, and we're gonna get to that more in the Shulchan Aruch, but on Shabbos afternoon, you have to make sure you eat your Shabbos before sunset, before the Shkia.
If you wash before then.
If you wash before, now your meal can extend after, as we're learning here.
Right.
But if you don't, you may not start after Vanish Mashach. That's what we're learning here. That once Shabbos, if you started your meal before Shabbos is out, and you continue going. But once you have the obligation for Havdalah, you may not start a meal, which is why those who wash for Shal Shabbos will make sure to go right away, so they get it before Vanish Mashach.
Imagine if we were sitting at the oil on a Friday night and you brought this up, we can go on all night.
That's exactly the point.
They did.
That's what they used to do.
We still, yeah.
Okay, let's keep on going. I want to finish this before we go to Mar Shulchan Aruch. Mifsik nami lo amran, and the obligation to stop your meat that you don't need to stop. I'm sorry, the fact that you don't need to stop your meal, right? If you started your meal early enough and you keep on going, you don't have to stop your meal. This is only true ela b'achila, if you're eating. Aval b'shtia, but when you're drinking, loy, then you don't have that permissibility to keep on going. You got to stop.
It's snacking. Right?
1 second, let me make sure I got it right, because there's two ways to read this. Gemara, look at Rashi again. I'm sorry. Yes, if you're drinking, you have to stop your drinking. Okay? Now, b'shtia nami, and drinking too, that you are not allowed to, the Gemara's phrasing is interesting, and Rashbam is a different reading, so I'm going to follow with Rashi. V'shtiya nami, and when you're drinking before Shabbos, before Shabbos is out, and we're told you're not allowed to do that because you're starting a meal. You may not start drinking beer or wine. That's like a permanent drink, and you may not start once the Havdalah obligation comes. Avamaya, but drinking water, less lamba, no big deal. Okay, so at this point, what would the halacha be? If you started your meal early enough, you don't have to stop at all. Once the time comes for Havdalah, you can't start a meal. that meal that you may not start is also true that you may not start drinking wine and beer at the time once Havdalah comes. But water you may drink. It's no big deal. You can drink water. It's a small little thing. That's what we have right now. But Rav Huna, this is in opposition to the view of Rav Huna. Because Rav Huna Chazia Lahu Gavra the Shasamaya Kadam Havdalah. Rav Huna observed some fellow who was drinking water before Havdalah once the obligation arrived. Amar Le, and Rav Huna told him, Loi Mistafe Mar Ama Askara. Are you not worried about the sickness called Askara? Askara is some sort of sickness that the Gemara refers to a number of times, which seems like it starts in the stomach and goes up to the lungs and causes asphyxiation. We had this Askara a few times, yeah.
Drink some beet juice or something.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So Rav Huna tells this fellow he's drinking water, are you not afraid of Askara? Why would drinking water cause Askara?
I think they drank that asparagus.
That's right, asparagus, that's correct, that's right, yeah, good memory. So Rav Huna tells him, are you not worried about Askara? About this asphyxiation? What does drinking water have to do with it? So he explains, autonomous made Rabbi Akiva, because we've been taught in the name of Rabbi Akiva being from the sages of from the Mishnah era much earlier. Rabbi Akiva said, anyone who eats anything before making Havdalah, misase ba'askara. His punishment is, God forbid, death by this askara. Which means there's one view that says it's okay, drink some water before Havdalah, we don't mind. As long as you're not eating anything that's like permanent, drinking wine. So again, if you start early enough that you may continue. But if you're starting once the obligation of Havdalah arrives, you may not have meal, you may not have wine or beer, but water, no big deal. But Rav Huna says, no, water is included in the ban. You may not drink water once the Havdalah obligation arrives. So much so that if you did, God forbid, a person's liable of this askara. The Gemara concludes, Rabbanon debate Rav Ashi, the students of the house of Rav Ashi, who is from the last generation of the Gemara's era, Rav Ashi being one of the redactors of the Gemara, one of the final redactors. So his students, like Kapdia Maya, they weren't so particular about water. They would drink water once Havdalah arrived. They weren't so particular like Rav Huna. Okay, this is end of the discussion regarding the prohibition. This is one of the tangents, right? We started off with our main subject, which is if you're in the middle of a meal Friday afternoon, what do you do once Shabbos arrives? And we affirmed that Rab agrees with Shmuel that you don't have to end your meal and make Berchat Hamazon.
Right.
You may not continue your meal because Shabbos says, "Hey, I'm here. You have to stop." So all I have to do is stop, cover your bread, and make kiddush, just like Shmuel. But which is the main subject of our discussion, which you're going to revisit later. But once we've brought that up, the Gemara compares that to Havdalah. Hey, maybe also Havdalah, if you're in the middle of your meal, you stop and make Havdalah. To which the Gemara said, no. When it comes to Havdalah, you're allowed to continue your meal going because Shabbos can extend. But you should know that once the obligation of Havdalah arrives, you may not eat. May not eat anything. What about water? What about beer? What about wine? So now we finish this section, we're going to look at, tomorrow we'll look at the first half of chapter 299 in the Shulchan Aruch, discussing these laws about what you may and may not eat before Havdalah starts, or once the obligation for Havdalah starts, and the fact that you may continue your meal if you started early enough. We'll learn that in the Shulchan Aruch, and then we'll come back to the Gemara, which continues on a tangent about Havdalah in relation to Kiddush, which is if you forget to make Havdalah right away, how much time do you have during the week to make Havdalah, and what do you do? And same thing with Kiddush. If you forget to make Kiddush Friday night, what do you do? That's going to be next. Okay, wonderful day, Eden.
All right, thank you.
What happens if they're if they're eating during the day? Right
Shabbos,
after,
when?
right
Friday?
after Shabbos. Right?
Friday or Shabbos?
Friday,
yeah.
they're eating Friday right after Shabbos.
Yeah.
But they're eating Mazonis. And they have to make Kiddush.
Okay, we'll learn that more in Reish Ayin Aleph. We'll get back to that when we get to chapter 271 out of Shulchan Aruch. If I remember correctly,
They have to make Kiddush over the bread.
you would cover the mazonis you're eating, you'd make Kiddush, and then make Hamaitzi, because you have an obligation to make Hamaitzi on Friday night.
Plus, if
But I
they-
don't think you would have to bench on your mazonis before you made that Kiddush, because the benching, the Berchat Hamazon you do after your bread will cover that.
That's right.
I think, I'm not mistaken, that's the correct answer. But we'll see more when we get to chapter 271
But you're,
after Shulchan Aruch.
you're covering the mazonos for reception's sake also.
Yes, that's correct, because you don't make kiddush in the presence
Yeah,
of
exactly.
your bread
Also, even though it's
or your
just-
mazonos.
it's just if God forbid it, somebody comes into the room and they see it.
Yeah, so we're gonna
Something is not
we'll get to all that. Yeah, why we yeah, that's correct.
Rabbi, I won't be here for 10 days. I'll be back.
Oh, safe travels.
Safe travels.
Please enjoy.
All the very best.
Have a wonderful day, Eden.
Shabbos.
Good news.
You didn't have to